Why did swords from across the world and throughout history go from having almost no handguard to having little handguard to having long crossguards to having yet a bit more protection and in some cases to absolutely loads of hand protection? Let's examine the context. Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria and Easton Antique Arms. Now, I was trading at an antique arms fair over the weekend and I got into a very nice conversation, long conversation where I monologued quite a lot, because I was asked why did long crossguards develop when they did, away from these short crossguards. What was the impetus for that happening? And indeed, extrapolating back a little bit further, why do we get these little crossguards that come out of almost no crossguard in the Bronze Age, for example, or the Iron Age? So why essentially do we get more and more hand protection over time? And why did it take so long to develop? And this also touches on something that Scal, my mate Scal over there, did in a very recent video I was watching this morning. And he touched on this point as well. And I completely agree with him. So fundamentally, at least in the early period, it comes down to shields. And in the later period, I would argue, it largely comes down to the lack of shields. We'll examine that more in a second. So, first of all, shields. So here I've got a Viking era boss grip shield, which sort of goes with this, this style of sword. Now, fundamentally, without going into too much level of detail, when you have a shield, assuming you're fighting a right-handed person, most of the attacks come from the right side. From your left side, from their right side. So right-handed people predominantly give attacks from their right side. Not, of course they can give attacks from the other side as well, but statistically, and this is even true in modern crime, stabbings and all sorts, right-handed people tend to predominantly attack from the right. For that reason, in the later medieval period, we even see armour is heavier on the left-hand side than on the right-hand side. So, if you've got a shield, this is brilliant because this covers the side that's going to receive most of the blows. Now, of course, you can cover the other side in a couple of different ways. You can defend with the edge of the shield like that. You can even turn the whole shield round to close your this line, the inside line. But if most blows are coming this side, when you are giving your blow here, you will notice, if I just angle it so you could see what the opponent could see, if I've got my shield, whether it's held out, far out, or even retracted here, when I give a blow with my sword, can you see my sword hand on my sword arm? No, fundamentally. So, not to say that obviously sometimes it does extend beyond or might come below or might even go above, but by and large, the line to the opponent's weapon arm, their right arm, assuming everyone's right-handed here, because it makes the argument easier, the line to the opponent's sword hand or arm is pretty much covered by a shield. Even if we go to smaller things here like this buckler, you'll notice that most buckler systems at the moment of giving a strike will have the buckler extended out to cover the sword hand. Even to the point where we've got detailed treatises later on, if you're striking from the right, you'll cover this side of the sword hand. If you're striking from the left, you'll cover that side of the sword hand. That's in 133, but there are other systems, for example the Bolognese systems, where they just hold the buckler out the whole time and strike around the buckler, but this does also cover the line to the hand in various ways. So, without going into huge levels of detail on that, fundamentally, shields and bucklers cover the line to the hand, and of course, it doesn't matter if we go back thousands of years to the Bronze Age, they were still using shields. So the line to the sword hand or sword arm, most of the time, if not all of the time, but most of the time, is covered by shields, targes and bucklers. So one might ask, why did longer crossguards like this start to develop? Why did they need to develop if the shield protects the line to the sword hand from accidental or deliberate hits? Well, there's a couple of things at play here. So much like evolution in living creatures, sometimes there can be something which gives a minimal advantage, but nevertheless, because it's an advantage, statistically it starts to become more and more prevalent over time. And it must be said that crossguards, because of angulation between the crossguard and where your hand is, or isn't rather, do provide quite a lot of protection. So there are some disadvantages to crossguards, we'll come to that in a second, but overall they are advantageous. So even if you were still using your boss gripped Viking era shield, having a crossguard may well still provide enough, even if it's marginal, enough extra protection that you'd want to have it anyway. And gradually, and this does seem to be what happened, Gradually over time, in the 10th century, the length on the guards started to get longer and longer. Where have I put that Viking era sword? There we go. So we do find there is a general tendency for these guard extensions to get longer throughout the 10th century, that is the 900s, such that by the time we get to the Norman era, the 1000s, 1000 AD, and through to things like the Battle of Hastings, 1066 and all that, then we find that the kind of general, the most common type of sword being used throughout Europe is with a relatively long guard. Not quite as long as this yet, but getting towards this. Now, funnily enough, there is I mentioned a disadvantage. There is a disadvantage. So one of the problems with having long crossguards is it can clash with your own shield. So when you come to do sort of winding actions or just moving around the shield, you can actually end up hitting your own shield with the guard. Conversely, there is another advantage which often doesn't get mentioned. When you are striking into someone who has a shield, oftentimes they will ram the edge of the shield or even the boss or front of the shield into your face, if they can, or into your hand. Now, if you have a crossguard, one of the really nice things is you can no longer smash your fingers, potentially breaking your fingers or knuckles, into an opposing shield. So this provides a really good angulation if you're in a shield wall, for example, and you're hammering away with your sword, a really good protection in a time when they don't wear gauntlets, of course, they've got bare hands at this time, a really good protection from the hand. Now, if I go back to the Viking era sword for a second, that does also work, okay? So you'll notice that that also provides enough protection to do that, but it's just a little bit more marginal. So for example, if I hit a boss, the boss will go into that gap and hit my hand anyway. So it does still protect, just not as much as the crossguard. But in this era, there's another factor. Now, it's a chicken and egg situation. Which comes first? Which leads to the other one? What am I talking about? I'm talking about strapped shields. So boss grip shields had predominated throughout Europe from well before the Roman era really, right the way through the early medieval period. But we find again in the 10th century, interesting, is it coincidence? It's the same time that crossguards start to get longer? I would argue no, it's not coincidence. But in the 10th century, we start to see the rise of popularity of strapped shields, particularly these famous types that are often known as Norman shields or teardrop shields, kite shields, whatever you want to call them. Okay, now, this is very different. They have strengths and weaknesses. I've covered those in previous videos. I'm sure I'll look at that again. We're not focusing on the shield here really, other than to say, when you have a strapped shield, whilst you can extend it quite far from your body, including the tip end or the front end, and we see both of these things done in period artwork, by and large now when you're striking, the hand is more likely to come beyond the edge of the shield than with a boss gripped shield, okay? So because the hand's more likely to come beyond the level of the shield, it means that the hand's more vulnerable. Now, does that mean that because they adopted those shields, they needed to adopt longer crossguards? Or was it that the fact that they started using longer crossguards meant that those types of shields suddenly became less problematic to use? But just to reiterate, when you have a boss grip shield with a lot extending beyond your fist, your hand is better covered than with a strap shield. So, chicken and egg situation, which came first? Did they just come along, I think probably in unison, and they worked well together? But longer crossguards start to appear at the same time as boss gripped large shields start to be overtaken by strapped shields. So between the 11th century and the 14th century, the simple crossguard is what predominated throughout Europe. And this is also echoed well beyond Europe. If we look at North Africa, or we look at the Middle East, or we look at Eastern Europe, and we look at well, even the Far East, we find that fundamentally we've got fairly simple guards, okay? Either simple crossguards like this, or of course if we go over to China and Japan, for example, then the simple tsuba like this. Now, before I go on to the next development in hilts, I just want to mention these simple hilts, but whether they be simple cross hilts, which we also find in China as well, not just these disc guards, But whether we look around the world, whether we look at the Islamic world or Christendom, or whether we look at the Far East, we find pretty simple guards. Now, they provide a decent amount of hand protection, especially obviously if you're wearing any kind of gauntlet or protection on your hands in armour. But even when you don't have armour on, they often offer a decent amount of hand protection, cross guards, disc guards, whatever, particularly when you're using shields. And most of these cultures, whether it's the Mamluks or whether it's the Burgundians or whether it's the Chinese, they're mostly using swords with shields. Okay, so it has the good balance between the handguard not getting in the way of the shield, but the shield providing enough hand protection that you don't need much more hand protection. Now, in the 15th century, we start to see developments like this. We start to see knuckle bows, we start to see the first finger rings and side rings, and that develop into things like this side sword hilt. Now, I've covered this topic quite a bit in previous, so I'm not going to go into a huge amount of depth, but really to say this is the period, the 15th century, well, you could say the 14th beginning, but particularly the 15th, particularly the late 15th century, when we start to see more and more soldiers not having any kind of shield, and the sword is a sidearm, is a backup weapon to something like a halberd or a crossbow or a bow or a gun. Okay, so I wouldn't say that firearms are necessarily the critical factor at this point in the 15th century, but the fact that these swords are sidearms and backups to other primary weapons, poleaxes, whatever, longbows, means that they need to be comfortable and easy to wear, but also the people using them aren't, for a lot of the time, going to necessarily have good hand protection. So these hilts, when we start to see these developed hilts start to develop with side rings and finger rings and knuckle bows and things like that, are for bare hands. And in fact, you can't fit period gauntlets in a lot of these hilts. You need to have at most a leather glove on, and you can't really fit much more into them. Okay, so they are for people who aren't in full armour. They need their hands for doing other things. We've covered that quite a lot in previous videos, and obviously that develops further and further forward into swept hilts and basket hilts, even eventually into cup hilts and other types of basket hilts and sabre and skivona, all that kind of stuff. So, to conclude, we've essentially got two main periods, the way I see it anyway, two main periods of consideration here, but one is far longer than the other. Okay, so one goes all the way back to the Bronze Age. Go back to the Bronze Age sword here. Fundamentally, they don't have any or almost no hand protection. What they do have is really to stop the hand going onto the blade because of shields. Okay, and that stays the case all the way through until, let's say, 1000 AD. Okay. In 1000 AD, there's this switch period between people using swords predominantly with boss grip shields to strap shields. And in that period, we start to see long crossguards. Do I think that's the only reason we start to see long crossguards? No, perhaps not the only reason, but I think it's probably the main reason. And it's a chicken and egg situation, I think. Having longer crossguards enables the strapped shields to be safe to use, especially in an age where they've got bare hands and they don't have any form of hand protection or gauntlet on yet. Okay, we go then through a medieval period from about 1000 AD to the 1300s, where really swords don't change very much. Fundamentally, they're essentially like this. They're a simple cross-hilted, most part, one hand length grip, a one-handed grip. Long swords do start to come around obviously earlier on, but that's a different situation. But fundamentally a simple crossguard is what they're mostly furnished with. And then we start to see complex hilts develop in a period where the sword is being relegated to mostly being a sidearm, and you need bare hands again, but they're concerned about hand protection, and so they start to develop things like basket hilts and swept hilts, which grow out of these simpler side rings and knuckle bows which have come on 15th century swords. Okay, so just to finish off, I want to mention the fact that many places in the world never really did this. Okay, at one extreme level, we've got, for example, Qing era China. Okay, they were still using the same kind of swords, fundamentally the same kind of swords that they'd been using since the Ming Dynasty. Okay, so Why was that? Well, fundamentally, I guess, because they were still using shields, they were still using bows. Yes, they were also using firearms, but fundamentally the sword was a backup to those things, the glaive or the lance on horseback, or the recurve bow, or the gun, or whatever. And, you know, for whatever reason, they just didn't feel the need to enhance their hand protection. Same with Japanese swords, of course. There is a middle case. Don't think that goes for the whole of Asia. There's a middle case, and that is Indian swords. Now, this is a talwar, but you'll notice it has a knuckle bow. Now, knuckle bows seem to start being added to Indian swords probably in the 16th century, and by the 17th century they've got forms of basket hilt. So in fact in India they had some degree, although different designs, some degree of the same considerations and preferences to Europeans. Was that also partly because of European contact? Because obviously by this point India was trading with, warring with, and partly being colonised by first the Portuguese and then the Dutch and the British and the French and everyone else. There's some back and forth kind of influence there, but equally India had had a long history of interaction with Afghanistan and Persia and various other places. So I don't know. It's very complex, and obviously the Mughal Empire played their part. So knuckle bows, they do start to add more complex handguards onto Indian swords. In Africa, for the most part, they got to the crossguard. In most parts of Africa, when they had swords, they get to the crossguard, like the Kaskara or the Takuba, for example. They get to the crossguard and they stayed there, which is one of the reasons why the Victorians and Edwardians likened African swords to Crusader swords, because they were the simple cross hilt. So, to conclude, throughout most of history, minimal hand protection or just a crossguard is actually what most cultures in the world have used, unless they came up with the disc guard, and that was pretty popular obviously in China, Mongolia, Japan, Korea, in quite a few places, and some Southeast Asia as well. So either no handguard, a crossguard, a disc guard, and that was true for literally thousands of years, okay? And the developed handguards are quite specific to a certain few places. And it has to be said, there is perhaps a correlation with firearm weapons as well, but certainly a correlation with the fact that people had bare hands and needed to protect their fingers to use for other things, like operating and loading firearms. Anyway, if you think I've skipped over anything or missed anything, do you disagree with my idea about why crossguards got longer in the, let's call it, late Viking Norman era? I personally think it's completely tied to the types of shield used. Anyway, I'll be interested to see your comments down below. Thanks a lot for watching. I have of course been Matt Easton and will continue to be, and I'll see you back really soon for another video. Cheers folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers folks.